Hey everyone, welcome back. I wanted to have a quick chat with you all about the possibility of a national divorce. This idea was recently brought up by Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, and initially I dismissed it as just another one of the crazy things she says on a regular basis. I figured that she would say it would get a headline, and then it would go away. But over the course of the week, she has doubled and tripled down on it. Now, this is obviously a really terrible idea, but I figured that this would be a fun excuse to do a little thought experiment and see what would actually happen if we had a national divorce where the red states separated themselves from the blue states. The first thing we have to figure out is which states are actually going to remain in the Union and which states are going to leave. On the surface, this is pretty simple. New York and California, they're blue states, are going to stay. Kentucky, Missouri, those are red states, they're going to leave. But there are other states where it's a bit more complicated. For example, Georgia voted for a Democrat in the last presidential election and has 2 Democratic senators, but the state government is controlled by Republicans. Kansas, on the other hand, has a majority Republican representation on the national level, but has a Democratic governor. So, it's not really so clear as to which states are red and which states are blue because, shockingly, politics is complicated. So, at the end of the day, we would have to have a referendum in every state where voters would be able to decide whether to remain in the United States or to leave and form their own country. Essentially a US version of Brexit. And once we compile those results, we could say that any states that are leaving are red states and the states that are remaining are blue states. Now, obviously we don't know the results of what any referendum would be, so for the purposes of our thought experiment, we will use the results of the 2020 presidential election. States that gave their electoral votes to Biden will be our blue states. States that gave their electoral votes to Donald Trump will be our red states. Now, there is one caveat I want to make regarding one particular state which would likely leave the Union, and that is Texas. Now, if you've ever met a Texan, you will know that they are very proud of the fact that their state is the only state that used to be a country. And I could see a very plausible situation where if this national divorce happened and the country split in two, it would actually end up splitting in 3, with Texas going back to being the Lone Star Republic rather than the Lone Star State. So, there are some places in our discussion in this thought experiment where that might have an impact, and when it's relevant, I will discuss, the different impacts of whether Texas stays with the rest of the red states or goes off to become its own country. Now that we've separated our red states from our blue states, let's discuss the transition process that might occur in order to help the red states extract themselves from the Union, because, let's be honest, a national divorce is simply a nice way of saying secession movement. So, at the end of this, the red states will be their own country, which we will call the Republican States of America, because I think that's a fairly accurate name. So, the Republican States of America obviously has a lot of things it will need to do. We'll need to draft a constitution, elect a government, hire people to staff that government, pass laws, all kinds of things. And that takes time. So, what I think is a fair proposal is that for the period of 1 year, the United States government will continue to collect taxes from red states and will continue to provide benefits that it normally would, things like Medicare, Social Security, etc. That way, people who are living in the new RSA can still have these benefits for the period of a year while the RSA figures out how it wants to handle things and which, if any of these policies, they want to keep. And it just allows the average person to have a little more stability and to be able to prepare themselves for what this transition might look like in a fairly controlled way. And I think that that's very fair. At the end of that year, if red states have paid more in taxes than they've received in federal benefits, that will be a debt that the USA owes to the RSA. However, if the RSA receives more in federal benefits than it pays in taxes, that will be the starting national debt of the RSA. I think that's fair too. So, and let's face it, that year is very helpful for the US to deal with any assets that it has that will be in the RSA. Because let's face it, there's a lot of federally owned land in all states, so things like national parks, military bases, the USA and the RSA are going to have to decide how they want to deal with that. Is the USA going to sell that land to the RSA? Is the RSA going to, let's say, lease an important military base back to the United States? These are just things that have to be discussed. And the last thing to do in that year is citizens of these states have to be given the option of what they want to do. Because there are red areas in blue states and there are blue areas in red states. So I think that people should be given the freedom to take that time and move to decide which country they would like to be a citizen of. Especially because, based on the way we've decided what state's a red state and a blue state, Marjorie Taylor Greene, the person proposing this divorce in the first place, is in a blue state. She's a representative of Georgia. So, I'd imagine that she would want to move to a red state and become a citizen of the RSA. So, I think she should be given the freedom to do that, and at the end of the course of this transition period, that 1 year, people will have to declare what citizenship they're going to take, whether they're going to be a citizen of the USA or the RSA. And after that year, the nations will be split, and they can go about existing as two separate countries. So now let's discuss what these two countries might look like at the end of our 1 year transition period. And we are going to start off with the Republican states of America because they are by far the more interesting of the two in this thought experiment. And we're going to start off with what their government might look like. Structurally speaking, it's probably going to be very similar to the US. It'll have a legislature, an executive, and a judicial branch. The whole checks and balances bit. But for its strength, it'll probably look a little bit more like the Articles of Confederation. Republicans always like to say that they are for small government, that they want to return power to the states, and that's what the Articles of Confederation were designed to do. Now, those of us who know our history know that the Articles of Confederation were an abject failure, and because of its failure, we got the current U.S. Constitution, but if that's what Republicans want, that's probably what they're going to end up writing. So the country is likely going to be a little bit more disorganized, and you're going to see continued fights between the several individual states of the RSA, as the federal government really won't have quite that much power to bring them to heel and make them act as a cohesive whole. The other thing we're going to look at in the section of government is fundamental freedoms, kind of the first 10 amendments, Bill of Rights type stuff. On the back end, the states' rights thing, obviously very prominent. Right to a jury trial, due process, all of that. Yeah, that'll be there. We'll see if they put in the Third Amendment about no quartering of soldiers. Probably will, just for tradition's sake. And the Second Amendment, obviously, you'll get that. You'll be able to own whatever guns you want. But the one that I'm concerned about for the RSA is the First Amendment, because many Republican politicians tend to draw on religious values when they craft legislation, and some of them, especially high-profile ones, are coming out and saying that they are Christian nationalists and want to create a Christian nation. So, freedom of religion is probably going to be out the window. And, on the surface, if you're a Christian, that's fine. But the problem is that there are a lot of different types of Christians in the U.S., so if it's not your kind of Christianity that's controlling the levers of power, you might find yourself obligated to follow religious laws that don't line up with your religious beliefs. And that becomes the problem when you have a theocratic nation, is whatever religion is in power is the religion that decides what religious rules will be followed. And you will actually kind of find yourselves in a weird Christian version of Sharia law. And for the vast majority of you, you better pray it's not the Mormons that get into power, because the Mormons don't allow you to drink coffee. At least caffeinated coffee. So, yeah. Pray it's not the Mormons, because that would be a catastrophe. But, additionally, you can say, oh, but, I will be doing my private thing, they'll have to respect that. No, they won't. Currently, we have Republican Governor Ron DeSantis, who has passed a number of laws and is working on more that would strip businesses of their ability to train their employees how they want or to enact certain programs. He's also going after educational institutions, including private ones, and saying what they can or cannot teach, and you can expect those restrictions to continue. Again, depending on what type of Christians are in power, they may decide that some things are appropriate or inappropriate, according to their religious tradition, and if you don't agree with it, it might just be one of those situations where, tough. And the same is true for the First Amendment freedom of speech. We've seen tons of Republican politicians saying that, we need to make it easier to sue people for defamation and libel. Generally, this is an attack that goes against liberal news outlets like MSNBC, CNN, whatever. But if, they're in power, they're going to change libel laws to make them look like that. And then if you go out and say, I don't like X politician, yada, 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 they can be like, well, we've made it easier to sue for defamation. You just defamed me, and now you find yourself in court. So, will the freedom of speech hold up in the RSA? Questionable, frankly. So, overall, yes, you're going to see a lot of these states' right freedoms, firearms freedoms, sure. But the core First Amendment freedoms, you might actually lose a little bit on, just again, based on the policies that Republicans have either enacted or said they want to enact. But for now, let's put freedom aside and talk about what's really important: the money. Specifically, the economy of the RSA and what that might look like. And we're going to start off with looking at what its GDP might be. Now, in 2022, the US GDP was estimated to be $26.13 trillion. And Republican states, according to the Census Bureau, contributed 37.33% of that. So, for our new RSA, their GDP would be $9.75 trillion. Now, obviously that's a lot smaller than 26 trillion, but hey, that's still the third largest economy in the world behind the US and China, so it's not doing too bad. However, this is one of those places we're going to talk about Texas because Texas makes up around a fifth of that total GDP, and if it were to go off and be its own country, it would be the eighth largest economy in the world just by itself. So, again, here's a financial incentive for Texas to go off and do its own thing because it's big enough to do its own thing. I mean, that still leaves the RSA, even if Texas leaves with $2.48 trillion in GDP, still keeps you at a comfortable third place. Nobody's really going to be after you. So, for size of economy, that looks good. Definitely viable. However, that figure is not quite accurate because there's another statistic out there which has been discussed pretty broadly in the news, which is that if you break GDP down by county instead of by state, blue counties produced 71% of the GDP, and red counties only produced 29%, so that is a pretty significant drop from the 37% when you do it by state. And that's because there's a lot of GDP production in cities in red states which tend to be blue. And here's what's going to make those numbers go down. During our transition, we're allowing people to trade sides. So I could see where people who live in these cities in red states, they're not going to like this new RSA government where that's leading. They're probably going to leave. In fact, we have seen people move based on abortion law, and I think more importantly than that, we've seen companies move based on abortion law. A big famous case of this was there was a drug company that was going to build a plant in Indiana, and then after Indiana enacted its abortion ban, it said that it would no longer build the plant there as it couldn't get people to come in and work there because the types of people they were looking to recruit tend to have a high educational background, and that tends to make them more liberal and more pro-choice. So it just became a factor of, we can't hire the people we want, so we're going to move the factory to somewhere where it is acceptable. So not only will you see people leave, you will also see companies leave. Again, another example that someone pointed out to me recently, Tesla's going back to California because it doesn't like what's going on in Texas. So when companies kind of see the RSA, they're going to move. And they're going to try and follow these people that they want to hire, who are also going to be leaving. So the odds are that that number is going to go down somewhat. And then let's look structurally at what the economy will be made of, and it'll mostly be an export economy. When you look at it, a lot of these states are rural, they're more agrarian, or they produce some kind of natural resource, specifically oil. That's the big one for Texas and Alaska. And that means you're going to have a very export-heavy economy. Now, there are pros and cons that go with that, but one of the big cons is that in order to make that happen, you're going to have a weaker currency. Obviously, again, you can't have the US dollar because that stays with the United States. The RSA needs its own currency. So, the RSA dollar is likely to be of lesser value than the US dollar because by having a weaker currency, it makes it easier to export because your goods are more affordable on the global market. That's a good thing. However, it also makes imports more expensive, and when you look at China, which is another country that has a very low-value currency and focuses on an export economy, it does decrease the quality of life for the average citizen because the things that you want, those manufactured goods that tend to be produced in blue areas, just aren't going to be as readily available, and they're going to be more expensive because the value of an RSA dollar is less than the value of a US dollar. So, you're probably going to end up seeing not only a drop in that GDP number, but also a drop in quality of life as the nation becomes more focused on exporting agricultural and raw material-based goods, and is then trying to import relatively more expensive anyway, processed and manufactured goods from either other countries or from the USA, which would obviously be its neighboring trading partner. Obviously, again, on the international stage, there's also trade agreements, which the RSA will not have access to initially. Over the course of that 1 year period, they might be able to negotiate them, but that could be yet another barrier to that export-import market, because if you don't have the trade deals that the US has access to, you could end up facing a lot of import charges, tariffs, etc., which, again, are just going to drive up the prices of those imports. And you want to know how complicated that can be. Go look at Brexit. They still haven't figured it out yet. And it has been quite some time since they started it. So that is not an easy process and probably wouldn't be solved within that 1 year period. So trading would be somewhat of an issue for that particular economy. Now, things aren't looking great for the RSA so far, but wait, there's more. Let's turn our eyes towards the starting national debt of the country, because, like we said during the transition, the federal government will collect taxes and pay benefits for that 1 year just to help keep things nice and stable. And so now we have to figure out who owes who money. And to calculate that, I looked at the 2019 balance of payments, which showed how much states paid in federal taxes versus what they received in federal benefits. And I chose 2019 as opposed to 2020 or any other year because post-2020, you start getting COVID stimulus money, which just throws all the numbers off, and we want to give all of these red states a fair chance to show that, under normal circumstances, they pay more taxes than they receive. And it turns out that of the 50 states, there are only 10 states that paid more in federal taxes than they received in federal benefits. Of those 10 states, one of them is a red state, and it happens to be Utah. All of the other Republican states received more in federal benefits than they paid in federal taxes. And once you add everything up, the net debt that the RSA would owe to the USA is $478 billion. So, fairly significant. Now, we could assume that that deficit would be the same if they keep the tax code similar, but knowing Republicans, A, they're going to cut taxes, but, they have talked on more than one occasion about cutting these programs. So, what the deficit would look like year to year, hard to say. But that's going to be the starting number for the national debt, and if their government spending wants to mimic at least something similar to what the U.S. is spending, that's going to be a pretty big thing to add to your national debt every year. Now, the other big expense that the new RSA is going to have is creating its military. Now, from a personnel standpoint, I think they'll be fine. There are going to be plenty of people who take the Robert E. Lee stance that I'm a Virginian first, an American second, who will essentially go back to their home state and decide that they want to be in the RSA military as opposed to the U.S. military, and that's fine. Where the problem comes in is not in personnel, but material, because wars are won on logistics. So, what the RSA doesn't have is bullets, body armor, trucks, tanks, airplanes, battleships, aircraft carriers, submarines, nuclear weapons. All of those things that Republicans think of when they think of the military would be things the RSA would not have, because all of that is property of the U.S. government, and during that 1 year transition period, the U.S. government's going to move all of its military assets onto bases that are going to remain in the hands of the United States. Whether that is bases in blue states, new bases in blue states, or bases in the RSA that are then leased back to the USA, because the U.S. leases foreign soil for U.S. bases all over the world. It's not an uncommon thing to do. So, the RSA is going to have to purchase all of these things, and that's very expensive. We know how big the defense budget is, so if the RSA wants to have a military, they're going to need to pony up for all of this equipment. And, the U.S. may sell some of it to them, but also, they might not sell them everything, because some of that is confidential to the U.S., and the RSA is now a foreign power that shares a very lengthy border with the U.S., and actually splits it in two. So, the U.S. probably isn't going to want to share all of its military technology with the new RSA, so the RSA is going to have to develop some of its own capabilities. Additionally, obviously, the U.S. is not going to leave the RSA with any nuclear weapons, so the RSA is going to have to contend with the fact that it's not a nuclear power. And if they were to try and become a nuclear power, they would probably face a lot of pushback on the international stage, because, as we've seen with other nations like Iran, North Korea, who've tried and, in some ways succeeded in becoming nuclear powers, the world is really against that. So the RSA would likely face a lot of global sanctions if it tried to become a nuclear power. So the RSA military is just not going to, at least in its early stages, be capable of very much. Now, that's actually probably not terrible because the RSA is likely to be more isolationist, is not going to be as involved in foreign conflicts, but it's just another large expense that the RSA will have to decide how much it really cares about having that military and what it's going to need to invest to come up with all of these materials that they need to support the personnel they would like to bring into their military. Obviously, we could be here forever talking about all the little different things that the RSA would have to do as a new nation, but I think we can look at all of them at the same time by simply looking at who would make up the power structure of a new RSA government and asking the question, can they actually govern? And the answer to that is maybe. When we look at Republicans in recent years, we find that they really aren't very good at actually passing legislation. There is a deep rift in the Republican Party between the more kind of businessy, Reagan, Bush era conservatives and the more Trump wing, America First, MAGA, whatever you want to call them, far right version of the party. And since there really won't be a Democratic or any other liberal party left in the RSA, you're basically going to have a fight between these two groups. And honestly, over the course of the last 10 or 12 years, we've seen that they're very good at coming up with slogans and saying what they want to do, but then when it comes to asking them what their policies are, they tend to come up a little short. You know, some of the examples: repeal and replace Obamacare. They said it for 8 years, and then when they got in power, they were like, oh yeah, we didn't actually come up with a plan for that. Combat inflation. Republicans in the current Congress have yet to pass any bill on that. They tried to do an immigration bill very recently. That failed just among Republicans, not even bringing in the Democrats. So we might see that the RSA may not even be capable of governing itself, as I don't think there's actually going to be a lot of agreement between the different wings of the Republican Party. So who knows if they'll even make it beyond the drafting of a constitution stage, let alone passing other laws and building a functioning nation. So overall, I think the RSA, well, it's very interesting to kind of take this surface look at what it might look like through this thought experiment. Overall, it's just a terrible idea for red states, and it provides them with, in reality, none of the benefits that they think that it will. So now let's talk briefly about the USA, all those blue states that remained. Honestly, for them, I don't think very much changes. Their economy is still the largest in the world at $16 trillion, putting them $2 trillion ahead of China. Their economy is still going to be very focused on services, especially financial services, technology, innovation, all of that. And they're going to be attracting all of those people who used to live in the blue areas of the RSA. So that number is probably going to even get better as companies and people shift out of the RSA back into the USA. Additionally, on the world stage, there's still going to be an incredibly powerful military. There's still going to be an economic force, political force. All of that's just not going to change. Domestically speaking, you might see certain policies enacted that wouldn't have been before, such as increasing the corporate tax rate back to somewhat of the vicinity as it was in the 50s. You might see things like Medicare for all, maybe even a UBI, who knows. You definitely would see politics in the U.S. shift to the left as, there aren't those red states to counterbalance that. And you might actually see a real leftist party emerge in the U.S. And overall, I think the U.S. would start to look a little bit more like Europe. So while this was a very fun thought experiment, I do want to remind everyone that there is absolutely no chance of a national divorce or any other secessionist movement succeeding, especially a secession of the red states whose politicians keep proposing these kinds of ideas. As we've shown, it would be generally disastrous and would likely cost the citizens of this new country a lot of the freedoms and benefits that they have grown accustomed to as citizens of the United States. However, I'm sure that politicians like Marjorie Taylor Greene are going to continue to propose this idea down the line, and while we all know it's a bad idea, it is sometimes fun to sit down, explore the idea in depth, and figure out exactly how terrible an idea it really is. Think about it. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more of my content, subscribe to the channel and make sure to hit the bell icon so that you get notified whenever I post new videos. If you want to support me on my other social media platforms, all of the links you need will be in the video description below. If you have any questions about this video or another topic that you'd like me to discuss, leave me a comment and I'll do my best to get you an answer. Thanks again for watching, and have a great day.